Wonderful to be here and have the chance to speak about and highlight some of my collaborative research. Before I begin, I'm going to make a few points. The first is that I chose to talk to you about a conceptual approach we're taking to our research to reinforce that in addition to doing empirical work that we all do about, in my case, environmental policy, and I work on how governance and authority emerges in some way to address the environment, especially concerning durable environmental policy solutions. In addition to empirical work, we also, in my lab, in my collaborative work, engage in theory building and conceptual analysis, which we know is fundamental for thinking about the broader context in which we situate all of our specific research projects. So being conceptual and developing theory is as important as empirical work in our lab and in the university in general. And integrating these different knowledge sources isn't important just for doing basic research, which is by itself really important. But my point is it's also important for helping society and governments solve particularly difficult policy challenges, okay? So I'm gonna hive off my conceptual stuff right now to show you how this actually works in my lab. And I look forward to your questions afterwards. I'm gonna share my screen. And yeah, there's the title, Solving Super Wicked Problems. So I'm gonna just sort of begin with then how we think about these questions before getting into how we try and solve them. And so, you know, if we think about super wicked problems, which is a term that I coined with my co-authors, Levin, Alden, Bernstein, back in 2007, we made the point that there were already these policy challenges known as wicked problems, but we added this super to it. So I'm giving you these visuals now so you can remember this talk in your head. Superman and the play in London combined to capture super wicked problems. So what are they? What are these problems? I think you kind of know them because they're kind of famous right now, and the climate crisis is certainly the one we hear a lot about, right? It's super wicked, and in part because it has pervasive impacts. The climate crisis isn't just one thing, but it does a bunch of things. It leads to icebergs crashing. It leads to increased forest fires around the world, and it leads to the bleaching of the coral reefs. Just 3 examples of a multitude of impacts that climate change has on our lives and on the ecology of the planet. And we also know that there's this 1.5 degree imperative that the scientists, so the people from the STEM discussions, those that are doing the actual scientific research tell us that to avoid catastrophic impacts, we must limit warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this chart was produced by the World Resources Institute. A lot of my students end up working in places like that, not just in the academy, produced by WRI as a way to coalesce the climate science and why we need to, and why this goal of 1.5 degrees has emerged. And by the way, it's a goal that almost every country in the world has agreed to try and achieve, including Singapore, under the Paris Accord. So this is an actual stated goal that governments want to achieve, 1.5 degrees warming or less. And yet we know that the world is not on track to do this. The world is not on track. All of us as a group are not there yet, right? So you can tell why we think this is super wicked. In fact, despite all this scientific evidence, and despite all this international agreements taking place, the world is actually getting warmer faster still. The latest data from the scientists telling us this. So wow, a problem we want to solve, and yet it's getting worse, right? And by the way, this coincides with the catastrophic species extinction crisis. Did you know, again, according to the STEM scientists, that 1 million species are being threatened with extinction right now, owing to the activities of these these animals called Homo sapiens, okay? Human beings are causing, through our behaviors, 1 million species to become threatened with extinction. That is also, therefore, a super wicked problem. And examples are everywhere. Here's just 2 of the 1 million, give you a visual. Orangutans in Borneo and the sage grouse in the United States are just 2 of the 1 million that are threatened with extinction. These problems are worsening. Again, the scientists from the STEM side tell us the problems are worsening. So what makes these problems super wicked? So Levin, Ald, Bernstein, and myself developed 4 key features. And I'm going to, again, walk you through the 4 key features to show you how empirical work informs our conceptual work. Okay, so we look at all this stuff happening. We see what the STEM scientists tell us. We see what the policy responses are doing or not doing. And then we work backwards to develop key features of super wicked problems that we argue you must be aware of if you want to solve them. So I'm going to walk you through the 4 key features and then say, based on those 4 key features, how do we solve them? Okay. And again, this is to show you how this lab works by integrating empirical with theoretical and conceptual work. So what's the first key feature? Time is running out. Again, the STEM scientists tell us that at some point in the future, it's going to be too late to act on the climate crisis, largely because we learned from the STEM scientists that carbon dioxide sits in the atmosphere for over 300 years. It sits there and builds up. And so at some point, we release too much carbon, and it's too late to act to avoid the catastrophic impacts. Likewise, we know that when species become extinct, it's too late to act. They're extinct, right? So we have this feature that does not apply to all policy challenges. For example, I worked in the United States for a number of years, and there are active debates around gun control to limit the use of firearms. You can go back to the policy process again and again and again on that issue. Time is not running out on gun control or many other issues like healthcare coverage and so on, but it is running out on these 2 crises, climate change and species extinctions crises. So that helps us, therefore, narrow down our universe of problems that we associate with being super wicked. The second key feature, and it's very unfortunate, is that there's no central authority. There's no one place to go in the world to get a solution to these problems. In the case of climate change, we live in a world of national governments that have authority to create policy over their populations. And we have very weak intergovernmental agreements. And hence, there's no one place to go in the world to seek redress. And that means policy authority is diffuse, making coordination difficult. And that's why we have to design in a way that actually incorporates this knowledge around no central authority. And this is important because we know from the climate scientists, maybe the STEM scientists, that it doesn't matter where you release carbon dioxide in the world. It doesn't matter. The same effect occurs in the ecology, okay? And that's why this key feature is really important. And why oftentimes well-intended policy action that doesn't take into account this feature doesn't end up solving the problem. The third key feature, and this is a very exciting one, and it goes a bit to a speaker we just heard from, that those seeking to end the problem are also causing the problem. And this is a debate we're having with ourselves, be it individuals, be it countries, be it global governance. We're fighting ourselves. And I often discuss how those scholars who work on environmental policy like myself love to go to workshops and conferences all over the world, and we fly a lot. If we were a country, environmental policy scholars would be the highest emitting per capita carbon country in the world, because we have this tension between what we care about and our behaviors. They're inconsistent, right? Now, this is not a new phenomenon. We know that from those who surf the web too much, or use our smartphones too much, or smoke and don't want to, or need to exercise. We know we have these problems with ourselves. And at the individual level, we find techniques to overcome these challenges. We might, for example, say, if I smoke a cigarette on Thursday, then I'm going to fine myself, or I'm going to find some way to punish myself to avoid the bad behavior. At the psychological level, we engage a lot in this kind of action to try and constrain our bad behavior to achieve longer-term results. But super wicked problems have this issue at the collective level. So our governance systems don't respond in ways that we want to for our long-term interests because we're battling ourselves, okay? Now, the fourth key feature is that policy responses discount the future irrationally. And again, going back to the STEM scientists, what we find is that the STEM scientists tell us, hey, big problems out there, you must act a certain way or you're gonna have catastrophic impacts, but our policy responses don't conform to that scientific knowledge, okay? One example I referred to a lot in my home country of Canada, in the province of Newfoundland, the STEM scientists told the fishers and policymakers that they were over-harvesting fish, and they had to stop harvesting so many fish if they wanted to maintain the fisheries in the long run. So what did the government do? It set up a stakeholder advisory body that had laborers and workers and the industry come together to decide on a compromise solution to what the STEM scientists said was the problem. And they set a catch rate that was considered legitimate, trustworthy, and consensus-oriented. But one problem, the catch rate they set was higher than what the STEM scientists said you had to engage in to avoid catastrophic effects of the fisheries management challenges. And what happened was the fisheries collapsed, right? So even though it was well intended, our governance systems oftentimes produce policy responses that are not rational based on the STEM science, okay? They're irrational based on the scientific knowledge that discounts the future in some way, discounts the future, even though it undermines the problem itself. So those four features we then worked hard to identify based on the empirical work from both the STEM scientists and the policy scientists around these challenges. So we said, okay, and we spent a couple of years identifying these four features, and we said, okay, if these are the four key features, then anything we do in the applied policy world, how to conduct applied policy analysis, useful for governments, useful for businesses, useful for NGOs, has to be consistent with these four key features. Has to be, right? We said, look, that means that if you want to solve these problems, you can't really go to traditional policy analysis techniques that tend to be applied by governments and tend to be taught in schools of public policy that I work in. And they're known as cost-benefit analysis, where you're trying to compare and contrast the outcomes of a policy choice on a range of behaviors and issues such that you improve overall economic welfare of society as a whole by doing cost-benefit analysis, or multi-goal policy analysis, where you compare different policy goals and kind of compare and contrast and compromise so society feels that they'd be listened to in a comprehensive and deliberative way. Both those approaches, which are very legitimate for many problems and can enhance trust and legitimacy and efficiency, are poorly suited to these four features. Okay, so we said, what can we do? If traditional policy analysis techniques that we've been teaching our students to engage in don't actually work for these policy challenges, what can we do? And we developed, along with other scholars that are working in this arena, the idea of path dependency analysis, which is motivated by three diagnostic questions that are related to these features. So the first one is, what can be done to brainstorm to create stickiness, policy stickiness, that makes reversibility of the policy difficult? And this would attend to the feature 1 and 4, if you could do it. Second question is, what can be done to entrench support over time? So how do you design policies where you get more and more support over time as time goes on? Therefore, avoiding the problem of putting off the future that so often occurs in supportive problems. And then diagnostic question number 3, what can be done to expand the population that supports the policy so that even in the absence of a collective authority, you can still actually get broader support over time. These are diagnostic questions. They're not answers, but they focus deliberative thinking around policy design in creative and innovative ways. So path dependency analysis becomes the tool, we argue, to deliberate conversations, to brainstorm around creative ideas. And the first priority is to find some way to constrain our future collective selves in some way through a pathways approach. And the idea, therefore, of creating a critical juncture that changes behaviors in a certain moment becomes really key for this analysis. The classic example of the critical juncture is anti-slavery norms that emerge 100 years ago and change the way everybody sees human behavior. You couldn't predict this, and it wasn't a universal principle, but it emerges historically and becomes then widely accepted across the world. And so the idea here is, how do we find easy to pull levers in the policy world that are hard to reverse? I know I got 2 minutes, but I'm going to go to one example to show you how this actually works in the real world. But here's your visual for the easy to pull levers that are hard to reverse. Some kind of ratcheting set, right? You can ratchet policies in a way that therefore they can't be reversed, and over time get more and more entrenched, would be needed to solve super wicked problems given their 4 key features. So what's an awesome example? I'll leave you with this awesome example that actually happened. Okay, this actually happened where policy designers acted in a way consistent with super wicked problems. And it's the case of the German government's effort to enhance the uptake globally of solar panels, which we know would help address the carbon crisis globally and, of course, domestically. So what did they do? What did they do? Okay, and this is really fascinating. So here's what they actually did. They built a policy mix called a feed-in tariff. Okay, and what this feed-in tariff did basically was that it had long-term contracts that it offered German homeowners who put solar panels on their rooftops. Okay, the long-term contract made the policy immediately sticky because a new government trying to reverse those policies would need to pay some kind of fee to break the contract. So it actually constrained future governments through the design of a contract versus simply a subsidy by itself. But then what it did is it said, okay, we're going to give yearly payments to homeowners. So over time, they get more and more support for it. This program, and they said they're going to pay homeowners, and this is really important, any excess energy that's produced from their homes at the retail rate, not the wholesale rate, into the grid, to go back to the grid. Well, this fostered a norm of low carbon behavior inside homes, because the more you wore a jacket, the more you didn't put on your furnace, the more money you made, because it went back to the retail grid, right? But the norm emerges that, hey, we ought to be enacted in ways that produce low carbon behaviors. This then in turn generated interest in Germans who didn't have this policy, and more Germans asked for the same coverage on their homes, and the policy proliferates in Germany, and more solar panels are purchased, which of course then we know from Economics 101, transaction costs are lowered, and so is the price of solar panels over time. And then, even though there's no global agreement on solar panel use through this mechanism, the idea becomes so important that 160 countries emulate the feed-in tariff in some way, including Singapore, right? Through a norm generation of policy design. And this, the economists tell us, over a 15-year period, did in fact account for why you guys pay less for your solar panels right now. What's important for this example is that you couldn't measure the impacts until 15 years later. You couldn't measure the changes in norms until 8 years later. You couldn't measure the behavioral consequences until after the experiment was run. And therefore, limiting our attention to simply empirical observations that occur within a few months can never get us to solve super wicked problems. And I'm going to stop there to give us some time for Q&A, but that's one of the things we do in my lab that I think is quite exciting, linking empirics to the future in ways that isn't constrained by past data, but uses it to think about new solutions and new futures.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishore. The floor is now open for